What's going on, everybody? Good morning, good evening, wherever you are and whatever time it is. Welcome back to another video with your man, Measureholic. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another faction overview for the Divide at Impera overhaul mod for Total War Rome 2. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are checking out the Kingdom of Armenia, otherwise known as Hike, but I'll just be referring to them as Armenia. Today, we'll be covering their campaign start, their military, and then I'll just be giving some general tips and discussion on their difficulty. As always, we will be beginning by looking at the buffs and debuffs that their faction receives. You are part of the Arzabam, otherwise known as the Eastern Empire's subculture of factions, which includes Parthia, Pontus, Atropatkan, and the Kartli. And as such, you have plus 15% ammunition for all missile units, and you also have plus 10 wealth from all commerce buildings. So you are going to be a fairly trade-focused nation, or at least that's where it's kind of hinting for you to go. 10% is significant, but it's not really all that much to be like, yes, quick, go do all commerce. But generally speaking, you do want to lean a little bit more towards commercial buildings. Moving forward though, jumping down to the Armenian specific buffs and debuffs you get. First off, you have the Bridge Builders perk, which gives you a diplomatic bonus with Hellenic and Persian factions. This will be very helpful, especially in the early game when you want to be selective in who you're conquering. You usually just want to do one war at a time, and that's generally a good rule of thumb for any nation, depending on your skill level, obviously. So this will be very helpful in keeping some factions at bay while you deal with other cultures that are around you, because you have a lot of different cultures surrounding your kingdom. Furthermore, you have the A Proud People perk, which is going to increase your morale in your own land. So that means land that you directly own. As soon as you step out of your lands, then you don't get that increased morale. So they're both decent perks, especially the first one. I feel like that will help you out the most, especially in the early game. But then the one debuff that you get is an increased naval unit recruitment cost. Basically, recruiting ships in general will cost more than normal. It's not a massive debuff, but it is a debuff that you'll notice once you become a larger kingdom or empire, really. Initially you start off landlocked, which is why you get this debuff, and while it's pretty easy to get a naval settlement or coastal settlement to give you some naval capabilities, you're not really going to be relying on using a navy until the mid to late game as Armenia. But that's it for the buffs and debuffs. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's jump into the part 1 section of this video where we check out the campaign overview. Let's do it. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, here we are at the part 1 section of this video. Let's check out the campaign situation for Armenia. Now, immediately you're going to notice that you actually have quite a few settlements. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 cities in total. 4 of these start off in your very own province of Hayastan, and then this other city over here you have, Samosata, is a part of Syria, which is very interesting because if we check this out, you actually instantly have access to some of the best units in the game. You can apparently recruit Cretan archers from this mercenary pool when they are available. You can recruit Syrian mercenary elephants instantly and Syrian heavy archers, and you can also get some I believe that's Persian. Oh no, that might be Syrian hoplites. So these are all pretty, I mean, I'm not too sure about the hoplites, but the rest of these units are fantastic mercenary units to have at your disposal. So that is a very nice early game tip to keep in mind. Now, considering all of these settlements, you also have 2 armies, one at Tushpa, your capital, and then over here in the west at Samosata. You will notice that I have taken quite a few turns in this campaign just so I can build a barracks to show you guys the population, but I have not done anything else. I have not recruited anything else. Except this one building here, which you may as well just ignore. We built a levy camp so I could show you guys some of the population issues that you may or may not have. And of course you also have 1 spy down here at Tushpa as well. So instantly looking at the geography of your kingdom and of your situation, really. You have a good amount of settlements. You have some very nice resources in Samosata. You have wine, and then up here in the northeast at Armenia you have gold, which is very nice to start off with. A lot of nations will want to trade with you because of that. However, you do not have any coastal regions. Like I said earlier, this is a landlocked faction, at least at the start of the campaign. So trade will be limited to people who you are immediately bordering. And so taking a coastal settlement like Phasis or Trapezoros will really help you get your trade flowing. And once you start making contact with other factions, especially over here in like Greece and Anatolia, trade will really flow into your kingdom quite quickly, especially as you conquer nearby settlements and get resources from them. So generally speaking, you're starting off in a pretty good early game position. However, I will advise some caution, and the main thing I want to highlight to increase this caution is that your cities are all pretty vulnerable. While you can move about halfway across your kingdom in a single turn, given that this is spring, which is generally a good time of year to be moving around, there is so many gaps in your territory. Basically every single one of your settlements can be attacked by an army that you can't see at the beginning of the game. For example, Samosata down here has this southwestern pathway down here, which immediately goes into the capital of the Seleucids, who will be one of your mid-game enemies, if not early game. And then it also has another path up here towards Pontus. Both of these factions can hit your settlement of Samosata within one turn. So while you do have a nice little clump of settlements, be careful. You can lose some of your cities without you even knowing that an attack is on its way. So be wary of that. Moving on though, as I said, you do have only 2 armies, and both of them have almost no units, and the units they do have aren't very good either. You do have a decent skirmisher unit here for your cav, but the rest of these units for your main army at Tushpa are pathetic. And then going to your other army in the west, it's entirely pathetic, with the one exception of your general. But beyond that, you gotta be you really gotta be on your ball when you're recruiting your army. You need a lot of troops very quickly. Just because you have a lot of territory does not mean the other nations around you will be pushovers and they won't want to come knocking on your door, because they will, and they will want things like wine, especially the Seleucids. The fact that you have a city inside their core province, you're almost instantly going to be going to war with them. Maybe not instantly, but quite quickly you'll be going to war with the Seleucids. They will want to solidify that border, and they're not really going to like your presence being there. Now, moving on to the next part, like I said, you can get trade flowing. However, you do need the nations around you to be friendly to do that. And so how is your diplomacy starting off? Well, initially, the only people who are friendly towards you are the Greek factions nearby, Pontus and Trapezoros. They're both quite friendly towards you at the start, and you'll be able to get some decent relations with them fairly early on, which is good and kind of bad, because Trapezoros would be a really nice settlement for you to take, since it's a coastal settlement and it's very close to your borders. But that takes us to your hostile neighbors. Colchis up here is hostile towards you from the get-go, and they are a coastal settlement, so you may just want to ally with Trapezoros and Pontus, at least initially, and then go get this coastal settlement, which is part of the Caucasian province up here, which includes the Kartli and the Ardhan. And you'll be wanting to take this province anyway, so you may as well just focus on taking out Colchis first, and then moving on to these other 2 factions shortly after that. And the Ardhan and the Kartli are fairly neutral towards you at the start, because you are of a different culture to them. They are Caucasian, you are Armenian. They will generally start to gravitate towards being hostile towards you unless you can get some relations established with them early on. Furthermore, you also have Atropatkan over here to your southeast. They are Persian, so you should have a diplomatic bonus with them. Generally speaking though, they can be quite a powerful faction, so if you're going to ally with them, try to do it early on, buy their friendship if need be, get some trade flowing and all of that. And keep in mind that they're actually independent of the Seleucids. And since the Seleucids are the major player in the east at the start of the game, maybe you could use them to ally against the Seleucids and take over Syria, Mesopotamia, and then after that, you two can fight over Persia if you like. But beyond that, the last part of your diplomacy we need to talk about is the Seleucids themselves. Obviously, they are a major power throughout the entire campaign, and they will be a major power, a major threat towards you from the beginning of the campaign. Quite often in my test campaigns, the Seleucids would declare war on me within about 5 to 10 turns, sometimes even sooner than that, depending on what difficulty you're on. But again, we're going through this overview assuming you're playing on normal. So if you can though, I would try to keep them at peace with you. I would not buy any non-aggression packs with them. It's not worth it since I'll break them anyway. But try to keep peace until they have the satrapies over here in the east rebel. And once they all rebel, then you join in the fun and start picking the Seleucids apart. They have a fantastic military. You cannot underestimate them. But you also have a good military, and you have a lot of auxiliary and Levy style units that will actually be very helpful. For example, you have some Armenian Axemen that will be very helpful in dealing with their elite heavily armored units, because you can overwhelm them with numbers, and they have good armor penetration. So the Seleucids will definitely be your major challenge for the campaign. Once you deal with the Seleucids, after that you will have Parthia or the Indian faction, or sometimes both, in the east rising up. Bactria I see usually getting stomped by someone. Parthia typically becomes a top dog. The Indians sometimes give them a run for their money. So be careful of that. But if you can get enough of the Seleucid territory, especially in Mesopotamia, you'll be making quite a lot of money, and it will be fairly defendable territory. You have some major cities here that are very good at being defended with just a decent garrison. So do keep that in mind. Try to take as much territory from the Seleucids as you can. But besides that, ladies and gentlemen, we're almost done looking at the campaign. One more thing I want to add though is that you have a lot of cities that also have a lot of population, and population is usually one of the things that is a big issue for a lot of factions early on, because they're like a one-hitter quitter faction, or they just don't have a lot of population in general, such as Sparta. But for you, this is a little bit different. For example, let's look at your capital of Tushpa. You start off with about 30,000 people at the beginning of the campaign. Your elites, the Azat Nakara, are fairly limited to just over 1,400, which is quite low indeed. That will be your very elite class, where you'll be getting your hectic noble cataphracts and whatnot. But then your warrior class, coming from the Ramic population, that's where you'll be getting your mid to late game units, and the Shinnekan will be available to you in droves, which is very good because they are basically your bottom tier units, but they're also very useful bottom tier units. For example, we have Armenian archers, we also have Armenian javelinmen, Armenian slingers, you have your Armenian Highlanders, otherwise known as Armenian Axemen, which will be super useful for you when you're fighting the Seleucids. They are very, very cheap, and they have good armor penetration. Their attack and defense is a little bit low, but the morale is actually okay at 44. The armor is at 8, so they won't die instantly to arrow fire or slinger fire, but it won't take them long. But generally speaking, they'll be very, very useful for you dealing with heavily armored nations. Just swarm enemy elites with them. They will take a lot of casualties, but you will be having cheap units dealing with very expensive units, which will be very cost effective. And then you also have Georgian Swordsmen right here, but they are part of your Ramic social class. Basically your warriors or your mid-tier units will be coming from that class for the most part. And even though these guys, I'm not sure if you'd want to use too many of them, because you might want to save that population for better units. You have 5 different cities to choose from. You have your entire home province, and then you have this city down here in Syria. So that's super useful. You're very lucky to have so much population at your disposal. Almost all of your settlements will be starting at around 30,000 people. You can't take these numbers too much into consideration, since it's been like 4 or 5 turns since the campaign started. Like I said, I fast forwarded a little bit. Samosata has a fairly small population with around 20,000, but even then, that's still useful. As long as you space out your armies when you begin recruiting units, generally speaking, you really shouldn't have too much issues with your population. Even if you start taking losses, as soon as you take over like a single enemy settlement, that will give you a lot more population to pump into your armies, and you will be doing that fairly easily because almost all of your neighbors are one-hitter quitter factions. The only ones that aren't Atropakan down here in the southeast, which you're not going to want to fight anyway early on, and then the Seleucids. Beyond that, almost all of Anatolia is full of one-hitter quitters. To your north, there are some one-hitter quitters, and that's including going up towards the Bosporan Kingdom and such. Really, you have a lot of potential for some very rapid expansion, so that's going to help you out a lot in your population, in your economy, and just your overall campaign. So, generally speaking, things are looking quite good for you on the campaign map. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to shut up about the campaign now, and we're going to move on to part 2, where we're going to cover the Navy and the Army of Armenia. Let's do it. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, here we are at part 2 of the campaign overview for Armenia. We are now checking out their military. We're going to have a very quick look at their navy, and then we'll be having a good hard look at their land units. Now, initially, you can see the navy of Armenia is pretty limited in what you can choose. Generally speaking, try not to use your navy as Armenia. Your ships are very, very terrible. They're very weak. They have the highest ship health you get is 600. That's pathetic. That's like a low tier unit for Rome or someone like that. Like, that will be the most basic ship that they will send against you. Really, your navy is terrible. Probably one of the worst in the game, because even considering, well, not considering your ship health, which is pathetic, the units that you have on your ships are also pretty terrible. You just have some basic Persian archers, and then you have some basic Levy Spearmen. The only thing that's redeeming is that your general units are Parthian Axemen, which would be quite good in melee combat. However, that is just for your general unit, and the most you get is 120 for your ship, and again, you only have a ship health of 600. That's the highest you get. Of course, not taking into account your siege equipment ships, which are a little bit different because they generally don't ram, and you won't be wanting to board the enemy with them. But yeah, out of your actual proper naval ships, the rest of them, it doesn't, let me just double check, most of them are around 500. 600 is the highest you get for your general unit, which is very low. Basically, bottom line, try not to use your navy as Armenia. If you do, try and get as many mercenary ships as possible, especially when you're going to Greece and Thrace. You'll have some good mercenary options there for you. But yeah, try to stay away from your navy roster. It is really bad, and there's just no way getting around it unless you start using units that are not your own. But anyway, now let's jump into the land units of Armenia. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we are looking at the military land units for Armenia. Now, as we begin, as always, we're starting off with the General's Bodyguard Units. This is one of your 2 Bodyguard units that you can get. This is your Armenian Noble Catastrox unit. You can recruit it as a standalone unit or as a General's Bodyguard. You also have a heavily armored spear unit that we'll look at a little bit later. But yeah, this is probably your most useful unit in the entire game. In the entire roster, I should say, for you, for Armenia, that is. But really, I mean, you could in theory just recruit a general specifically just to use this unit to be a reinforcing unit for your main army. It's very, very useful indeed. Highly recommend you use this over your spear unit equivalent or spear unit bodyguard unit. Not many reasons why you would use a spear unit instead of this, unless you only wanted to defend a city of your choice. But as you can see, they're very heavily armored just by looking at them, and then we look at their stats. Very impressive indeed. You have a charge bonus of 63, melee attack of 11, defense of 10. You even have armor penetration of 11 with a bonus against infantry. Your armor is at 53. base morale of 52, and you have a speed of 5, which is fairly decent considering that you're so heavily armored. But it's still not amazing either. Parthian horses, for example, will run you down pretty easily. Even their more heavily armored units may be able to chase you down, so be careful. And you do unfortunately have poor stamina because your horses are so heavily armored, so do be wary of that. Your units will get tired. But generally speaking, this is a fantastic unit. I'm really impressed that you can get this early on with such a massive charge bonus. And again, as always, little caveat, horses do have their own statistics. There are several different types of horses in DEI. I don't know them all at the time of this recording, so I'm not going to comment on it, but there are some hidden statistics that do affect the usefulness of cavalry, which we'll hopefully discuss in a future video. But I mean, you still can't ignore these statistics. They are very indicative of what kind of unit this unit is. It's going to be very useful, which is the bottom line. But anyway, that's more than enough time that was spent on your General's Bodyguard unit. As you can see, we have a decent amount of troops to go through here, but most of your roster seems relatively balanced. However, your main exception is your skirmishers.
Our aim is through.
We have some Caucasian archers here, Armenian slingers, Armenian javelin men, and that's kind of it. Besides these most basic skirmishing units that you do get, if you like, I can bring this up so you can see the unit cards. Here they are. Here I try to group them all together. These are all incredibly basic units. There isn't really much to say about them at all. They don't even have armor penetration, so it's not like they are like the Skodishi who actually had armor penetration for the skirmishers. These guys don't. They basically got nothing. Try not to use them in melee if you can. If they do get in melee, they won't last long and they will get cut down. But
we await your orders.
Things do change a little bit with your Armenian heavy archers, but only a little bit. Even though your melee stats aren't fantastic, you have a melee attack of 9, defense of 7, which is quite low, charge bonus of 13, although you do have a weapon damage of 23 with only an armor pen of 3. The main reason you would want to use these guys is because they have a decent damage at 16, although it's not all that high, it's still decent. Range of 175, ammunition of 15 as most archers do. However, the main attraction is their armor, which is at 35, very high indeed. These guys are just a little bit under Syrian heavy archers, so that will be quite useful to you. Your other skirmishers are basically just bottom tier all around, and so you're going to be using Armenian heavy archers or these other low tier units basically in large quantities if you want them to be really useful. Otherwise, rely on AOR and mercenary units. Keep in mind you can get some of the best archer units in the game instantly from your Syrian settlement that you have. You can get Syrian heavy archers, and you can also get some Cretan archers instantly. So use that and abuse it as much as you can. But yeah, this is your elite archer unit. Looking very fantastic, especially that officer. Far out. He's looking like a champ. He's ready to go. He's got to be like a prince or something with that outfit. But anyway, moving on from that. That's your skirmishers. Fortunately, it doesn't really... well, it does get better, but in the skirmisher department, it does not improve for you. However, moving on from that, we get to your spearmen. As you can see, you have quite a few options with your spearmen. Now, this is your Armenian Thurio spears. That's right, Thurios, meaning that you have quite a heavy Greek influence on some of your units, and we'll even see a Roman influence a little bit later. But these guys will be quite helpful, as most Thurio spears are. They will basically be charging down enemy cavalry and enemy elephants, keeping them occupied, and they even have 300 men in their unit, which is quite useful. Even though they don't have the most amazing stats, they still have quite decent stats. Melee defense of 17 will keep them fighting even infantry for a fair while. An armor of 20, which is quite respectable. Base morale 43. Their speed is kinda, I wouldn't say it's low, but it would be nice if it did pop over 4. But speed of 3 is still decent. Generally speaking, they're just quite a good spear unit for you. You just need to wait until you get the Thurios reforms from the Greeks to start using them. But they will be a very helpful mid-tier unit for you. Here are your Caucasian Spearmen. Not really a lot to say about them. They are quite bottom tier, fairly cheap. However, they do have an armor of 15, and they have a large shield, which gives them that melee defense of 12. So these guys aren't completely Levy units, but they're very close. They're basically a small step up from your Levy units, about half a step if that. And speaking of which, can we skip ahead to your...
Spearmen ready for orders.
Here we go. Here are your Levy Spearmen over here. And you can see what I mean by just about half a step above. Same melee defense, but you have slightly less attack. Some other lesser stats, such as your armor only being at 8. But you do have that large shield again, so that will help you deal with slingers. But beyond that, larger projectiles like siege equipment, obviously. But javelins and archers will be dealing a lot of damage to your units. So this is your most bottom tier spearman unit. But getting back into
Noble Spearmen!
our lineup here, we have some veteran spearman units right here for you. This is basically probably the best spearman unit that you have if we don't consider your pikemen. You do have Armenian Legionary Spearmen, which we'll look at in a second, which are just slightly underneath this statistically. If we just look at them back and forth a little bit. The main thing the Armenian Legionary Spearmen have is better armor of 38, which is quite substantial. But the rest of the statistics are lower pretty much across the board. So, yeah, this Spearman unit here, your Kentro Nakan Spearmen, they're basically elite Spearmen. They do only have 200 men in their unit though, but far out, they're fantastic. Melee defense at 21, armor 28, which is still quite good. Bonus versus cav at 12, melee attack of 9, which is good for a starting elite unit that will only get better as time goes on. So 9 is actually very good indeed for a spearman unit. The only real issue with him is, well, there's actually two things. One, they only have a speed of 2, which is kind of low. Considering they only have an armor of 28. I mean, their armor isn't bad. It's still, it would be considered heavy probably, even though in the grand scheme of things I would consider that to be almost mid-tier. Their speed is just kind of low, considering that they also do not have a shield wall ability. They have no shield wall. That's actually quite substantial, and it means that they won't be able to hold down choke points as easily as some other units might. For example,
Pikemen!
You're pikemen. Armenia gets pikemen. You get 1 unit of pikemen, not including mercs or AOR units. Fairly standard. Not really too much to say about them. They are just a solid mid-tier unit for you. We have an armor of 28, which is actually quite respectable for a pikeman unit. They're going to definitely give you a lot of options with your army. Already we're seeing that you have quite a few options with your spearmen, and you can even choose between having spearmen or pikemen as possibly a main battle line unit for you, at least for some of your armies. So that would be very helpful for you. Keep that in mind, but beyond that, not really too much else to say about them besides they just have good solid mid-tier stats. But then we move on to your Armenian Legionary Spearmen. This is one of your 2 Legionary units that you get. Basically they're a step up from the Furios, but a step down from your veteran Spearmen, which is a bit of a shame, but that's okay. And by the way, that veteran Spearman unit we just checked out is your other Bodyguard unit. This Legionary Spearman unit will basically be your mid-tier unit. Well, not mid-tier, I should say. This will be, it'll be your high mid-tier Spearman unit. They're very useful. They're just 1 step down from your elite Spearmen, but the rest of your Spearmen, they're just better than. I would easily use them over Thurio Spears any day of the week, except for one thing. They only have 200 men in their unit compared to 300. So it could be argued that the Thurio Spears are going to be more useful, but the Armenian Legionary Spearmen are not going to die anywhere near as quick, since they have a really good defensive 19, and they have excellent armor at 38, and
as you wish.
They have the discipline formation ability. However, the discipline formation is useful for holding a position, but it's not good for killing units. It's not really going to get you a lot of kills, so I would be scarce in when I use that ability. It's not like it turns your unit into a hoplite unit. It doesn't. It basically just means that they plant themselves in that position. So it's useful. It's better than nothing, but a shield wall ability would be definitely preferable in my opinion.
What are your orders?
And then, of course, there's your Armenian Levy Spearmen, like we had already just talked about. I just wanted to cover them earlier. So that's all of your Spearmen. Quite a few options from your base roster, and that's not even including any AOR or mercenary units. So very indicative of what you should be trying to use. But moving forward, we are at your melee / axe and sword units, or mainly sword units. In your roster, you only have one dedicated axeman unit, and that is right here, the first unit we're going to look at, which is your Armenian Highlanders. These are going to be a very, very, very useful unit for you. They have 300 men per unit. They have a melee attack of 7, defense of 7, which is kind of low, but they have an armor penetration of 12. So when they do hit, they will be doing some decent damage. And you have 300 of these guys who can get involved in a fight. And they're also very cheap on the campaign. I mentioned that in the campaign overview part of this video. I will repeat that. These Armenian Highlanders are very cheap. So you can make massive amounts of them inside of your armies. Generally speaking, you'll be able to funnel quite a lot of these units into your armies, and they will be quite useful against the Seleucids in particular, who have fairly heavily armored units. Moving on now.
Orders, my lord!
Armenian Legionnaires. Basically, the name is what you get. You have Armenian soldiers who are now in the armor and the fighting style of Roman Legionnaires. They've learned quite a bit from Rome at this point. And yeah, they just look like Armenian Legionnaires. They look fantastic. They have nice shields, very good armor, and it's reflected in their stats here. An armor of 35, which is very, very good for a base armor. Melee defense of 14, melee attack of 11, weapon damage of 26. The only thing about them though is that their charge bonus is a little low at 18, and their armor pen is only at 4, which isn't horrendous, but it's not all that good either. So they're basically a good battle line unit for you. You can either go down the Spearman route for your main battle line, or you can use guys like these to present a proper professional battle line where you don't want to just spam Armenian Highlanders. These guys will be very useful indeed, and they have the discipline formation ability,
Into formation!
and they have the defensive testudo ability. However, the defensive testudo is kind of it's a bit of a double-edged sword. One, you will be able to defend yourself against projectiles coming your way, but as soon as you get into attack, that's where you're going to have some trouble, because your unit can get surrounded very easily. So I'd really recommend you try to use this only when you know your units aren't going to be fighting in melee. But yeah, beyond that, super useful unit, and they look fantastic.
Orders, my lord!
Speaking of which, we then move on to the Nakara Cavalry Swordsmen. I'm sure I pronounced that perfectly as always. But yeah, you basically get thorax swords. Again, this is coming from your Greek reforms, and not only do they look friggin' insane, like, are you kidding me? Look at this dude. Look at that. This is like the movie 300 with the Immortals in it. Although don't get me started on how incredibly historically accurate that movie is. Oh man, I'm sure like half of you guys just exploded your brains with me saying that. Of course I'm playing, I'm messing around. But those masks really do give a bit of an Immortals vibe with that. That's really looking sick. These guys look friggin' awesome. They look terrifying, and they should, because their stats are fantastic. Are they better than your Legionnaires though? Let's compare them, because I have not compared them too much yet. I would say almost without a doubt they're better. Better armor, better morale. The only thing that they're lacking is a little bit of melee defense, but they make up for it with a larger charge bonus. And they do have less weapon damage though, but they have armor penetration of 14. So these guys are heavily armored, they have high armor penetration, and they do, however, only have 200 men in their unit as well, and they have no formation abilities. But yeah, basically a elite thorax unit for you, because
At the ready!
you have some generic Armenian thorax swordsmen, which is fantastic. This is going to be a super mid-tier, oh my goodness, a super useful mid-tier unit for you. They have fantastic stats pretty much across the board. The armor is at 25, which is kind of lower than your other units such as Legionnaires and whatnot, but you won't be getting Legionary units until far later in the campaign anyway, so your Thorax Swordsmen here are going to be super useful. These guys can also form a main battle line if you so wish them to. They also have javelins to throw in, as most of these other swordsmen do. Just very, very useful. A lot of your Armenian troops that we're looking at now are very useful, which is awesome. A lot of the rosters we've looked at, I feel like I have to skip through quite a bit because some of the units don't have as much purpose or they don't have as much use. But almost all of your melee units, in fact, no, all of your melee units we've looked at so far have been useful. Even your most plebby Levy units so far has been useful in this category of swords and axes. Even almost all of your spearmen are quite useful. The only thing that isn't really is your basic Levy Spearmen, who are basically just there to die. But that's a use in itself, I guess. But yeah, so far your swords are quite impressive indeed.
We await your orders!
Moving on from that, oh goodness, get out the way, bushes. What are you doing there? We have some Georgian medium infantry. Basically, it is what it says. These are Georgian soldiers who are willing to fight for you, and they are basically a mid-tier unit. They're looking very nice. Of course, they kind of have that Principe style, like what the Romans get with their Principe units. How they have some decent armor, a small shield, but they also have javelins as well. Well, a javelin, I should say. They have an armor of 25, which is quite impressive. Melee attack of 14, which is very aggressive. However, they only have an armor pen of 4. So these guys will be an aggressive unit, but when they're going up against like Legionnaire troops or high tier elites, they're going to end up losing most likely, unless they have some support. In a one-on-one engagement, I would not trust them to take on Legionnaires, but let them get a rear charge or let them get some support. These guys will do quite well. They will make up a main battle line for you if you so wish, just like the majority of the rest of your swordsmen besides your elites.
Ready to march!
And then we're looking at your most basic melee units you get in the swordsman department. You have your most basic axeman unit, which is really your only axeman unit. That's part of your core roster at least. But your Georgian Swordsmen here are one step down from the medium tier swordsmen. However, they do have 300 men per unit. So this will be one of the units that you use in like the first 10 to 20 turns of the campaign. After that, you don't want to touch them. You want to use any other unit you can, such as the medium tier swordsman. These guys are still fairly okay though, considering they're your lowest tier melee unit. They have an armor of 15 and attack of 12, so they're quite aggressive and their armor will let them survive for a decent amount of time. However, their shield is pathetic. Look at that tiny little thing. It's not going to stop nothing. So they will die to skirmishes fairly quickly despite having an armor of 15. Their defense is pathetic at 4. Charge bonus of just 15. So these guys can get some kills, but I would not rely on them to do so. They're basically going to be your levy troops in your armies, and you won't want to use them once you have these mid-tier units, these great mid-tier units available to you. But that's it for the infantry. Now we're moving on to your cavalry. As you can see, spears and swords are looking fantastic so far. Skirmishers are severely lacking. However, let's see if the horse skirmisher department can save it. But to be honest, the bottom line is that it can't. It gets kind of close. You do have some decent-ish skirmisher units, but nothing really to write home about. For example, your Armenian Skirmisher Cav, they're basically your low-tier javelin unit on horseback, and in fact, they are your only javelin unit on horseback, notwithstanding AOR and Merc units, of course. But they have only an armor of 11, which is pretty poor. Weapon damage of 30, though, which is quite interesting. And that should not be for their missile. I believe that's for when they're in melee engagement, but that can't be right, surely. Weapon damage of 30, that's interesting. I'll have to look into that a little bit more, because missile damage should cover the missile that they send off, which will be the javelin. But anyway, they have an ammunition of 6, which is okay, but fairly basic. Generally speaking, the only stat that they have that stands out, besides this weapon damage stat, which, you know, got to take with a severe grain of salt, is their speed. They have a speed of 8, which is indeed quite useful. and they will be able to charge down enemy light skirmisher units and enemy heavy cavalry and tie them up while your good cav comes in and gets involved. But yeah, just like your skirmishers of infantry, your skirmisher cav are struggling to start off with. Moving on from that though, we move on to the Armenian armored horse
Cavalry!
archers.
Missiles
This
ready!
is instantly quite a large step up from your previous skirmisher unit we were just looking at. First off, they're an archer unit, so they're going to have more range naturally. They do have a very good missile damage of 17, which is quite good for an archer unit. Ammunition of 15, which is nice because that's the same as what infantry archers get, so that's also quite useful. They have an armor of 47, which is quite substantial, but this is basically the best your skirmishers get, really. We do have one more unit to look at, but that's below this tier. This is basically the most elite that your not your horses, but your skirmisher cav will get. The rest of your cav gets excellent, but yeah, this is basically the best you get. I'm not going to read all the rest of the stats, but it is worth noting that they do have a melee attack of 13, indicating that they're quite an aggressive unit, and they'll be very useful in that they have a decent armor rating that gives them a good charge. It will be useful in their charge as well, which your charge bonus is at 37, which isn't all that high, but it's still decent. But they'll be able to charge into enemy infantry, enemy cav. They'll still win quite a few of their engagements. In fact, they'll win most of them on their own, and they'll still be doing damage on the enemy from a distance. But then moving on from them,
Horse archers!
we move to your Armenian horse archers, which are just basic Armenian horse archers. There's nothing really to highlight about them. Yeah, statistically, the only thing that's worth mentioning is that they have a speed of 8, which is quite good. And again, just like your skirmisher cav, they will be able to run down enemy light infantry, levy units. You'll be able to run down
Cavalry!
almost any unit with a cav unit that has a speed of 8. But yeah, that's pretty much all we have to say about this unit. The one thing that they have useful is their speed, and they are also a horse archer unit, so they'll basically be useful for your very mobile armies that you need to defend your large kingdom that you start off with. They'll be quite useful if you want to do an all cavalry army as well, so keep that in mind. But that's it for your skirmisher cav. And then from then, we move on to your 4 other units, not including your general's bodyguard, which is a very useful cav unit. Make sure you remember what I said about that. But moving on from that, we have 4 other cavalry units for you to check out.
Ready!
We'll look at the Nakara Cavalry. These are one of your better cav units in that they are very heavily armored. An armor of 51, melee attack of 10, defense of 13, charge bonus of 48. Fairly decent considering that these guys are mainly a melee cav role. They're not really shock cavalry. They do have very good armor. They have a decent charge, but they're going to be using their attack skills and defense skills in close quarters combat over a duration of time. These guys won't be getting a massive amount of kills on the charge. Instead, leave them in prolonged combat against lower tier units, and they will come out on top almost every single time. They're very, very good for a melee cav unit, but any cav unit can be used as shock cavalry if you're so willing and if you're decent with your micromanagement. But again, they just look fantastic. It must be that Nakara theme where they have these awesome helmets. Again, just giving off that Immortals vibe. Very, very cool indeed.
Knights!
From that though, we move on to your Armenian Azad Nobles. This is one of your lower tier cav units, but they're still quite good with an armor of 45. Armor really says a lot about your cav. It means that your cav is going to survive quite a bit longer than normal, considering that you have such a larger hitbox than say infantry. So that is going to help you out a lot. Charge bonus of 45, which is still quite respectable. Melee attack of 9, melee defense of 13. Again, these guys are not shock units. They would be best used in prolonged combat against units that are of similar or lower caliber, but they don't really have any special abilities beyond that. So just keep that in mind. They're basically a slightly worse version than the Nakara Cavalry. But yeah, as a result, they will be cheaper, so keep that in mind as well. Moving on though, we're getting to some of the more juicy parts of the cavalry for Armenia. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are getting to the cream and butter of Armenia, your Armenian Catastrox. Now, at the start of this, I talked about the General's Bodyguard unit that is a Armenian noble Catastrox unit. And this is actually a step down from that. And I kind of made a bit of a boo-boo in saying that the Armenian noble Catastrox, your Bodyguard unit, are not your best shock cavalry unit. I thought you had one that was higher tier, but I confused that with a Parthian unit I was comparing it to earlier. Basically, your Armenian Catastrox are the best Catastrox unit you get next to your General's Bodyguard. They're still incredibly useful though. Charge bonus of 59, which is massive. It's still not going to go toe-to-toe with most Parthian units, for example, but Parthians are specialized in Catastrox. They have the best Catastrox there are. But they're still going to be beating a lot of other nations in the charging department. An armor of 49, you have a bonus versus infantry, and you have an armor penetration and a melee attack of 10. You'll be doing a lot of damage on the charge with these units. Just don't let them get stuck in melee, for they will die relatively, I wouldn't say easily, but I mean, yeah, it could be argued that they would die relatively easily in the grand scheme of things, considering that they are an elite cavalry unit. So you do want to be careful with them. But their high armor will keep them alive for a while. And a melee defense of 8 is still okay, but they don't have any shield, and because they are a horse unit or a cavalry unit, they will have a larger hitbox than an infantry unit. So a melee defense of 8 for this unit is different than, say, a melee defense of 8 for like one of your swordsman units. It's quite different indeed, and it means it's basically worse in the defense department, to be honest. The other thing saving is its high armor. But beyond that, there isn't too much else to say about it. Just a fantastic Catastrox unit. But I would not argue that they're in the top 5 Catastrox in the whole DEI mod. I wouldn't even argue that they're in the top 10. But they are still great. But then you move on back to your General's Bodyguard unit, which I'll talk about again momentarily, just to reiterate it. But they're still very good. Very heavy shock cav unit. And they're definitely one of the better ones that you can get compared to other factions. But once you start comparing it to Persian factions, that's where it's definitely going to be taking a bit of a backseat. But it's still fantastic when you're going up against, like, say, Caucasian factions or Greeks and such. So definitely use those as much as you can. And then here is your Armenian Cavalry. These guys are not a shock cav unit, although they do have a charge bonus of 44, which is not bad at all. Comparing it to your other 2 melee units, they are at 45 and then 48 in their charge. So this is the bottom of your melee cavalry that you get, but they're still very, very useful. An armor of 28. Base morale is only at 39 though, so do watch out. They might rout a little bit early on compared to your other cav units. But yeah, they're just a very solid low tier melee unit for you. And I say low tier considering the rest of their roster. But comparing this unit to, say, like a Galatian unit, this will be a solid mid-tier unit for sure. Very useful. Hopefully, due to their lower stats compared to your other units, so they will be cheaper, and thus they may be more cost-effective even. But let's move the Armenian Catastrox over so we can compare them to your General's Bodyguard unit. So your General's Bodyguard unit is the best shock cav you get. At least straight up stat for stat. But let's look at exactly why that is. So armor 49 for the Armenian Catastrox, jumps up to 53 for the Bodyguard unit. They also have a higher base morale of 52 on the Bodyguard unit compared to 49. Better attack, better defense, better charge bonus like I said, better weapon damage. The only thing that your Bodyguard unit does not do better than the Armenian Catastrox unit is speed. And the speed is at 5 compared to 6 for the Armenian Catastrox. So generally speaking, you just want to use your General's Bodyguard unit as much as possible. It's just such a useful unit, and it's available to you from the beginning of the game when you recruit general units. So you can really use and abuse this as much as you like. You can recruit a bunch of generals, keep them close to some of your main armies, and just have them come in and reinforce. It's a little bit gamey, But if you're struggling, and if you're new to DEI in particular, it may be a very useful tactic for you. Maybe bring in some spare melee cav units with him, such as your Armenian Cavalry, who will be very versatile in their role, and have them support your general. But yeah, it's just super impressive, this Cavalry Catastrox unit. But Parthia will easily still outclass this unit. Despite its fantastic stats, Parthia will beat it any day of the week with its highest tier Catastrox unit it has. So keep that in mind. It's not the best in DEI, but this Bodyguard unit is definitely up there. Definitely within the top 10 in my opinion. But ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have to say about the military of Armenia. I was kind of expecting there to be more things wrong with the roster, but to be honest, since the DEI team has overhauled the entire faction, they've done a fantastic job. All of the units look fantastic. There isn't really any generic looking units. All of the units make sense. They all feel like they have a purpose, which is really nice, especially coming from like our faction overview of the Skodishi, who a lot of their units, you're just like kind of, why is this unit here? I won't get into specifics about that, but there was definitely a couple groups of units in the Skodishi who didn't really make too much sense. But for each unit here, it's always a purpose behind each unit, and generally speaking, you do have like steps up from each unit until you get to elite tier, so it kind of feels like you have a little bit more progression to go through, which is always nice and comforting. And I feel like it's a little bit more of a rewarding system, especially for newer players of DEI who are yet to master the armies and the tactics associated with the mod. But anyway, now we're going to move on to the part 3 verdict of this video, where we'll talk about the difficulty and some final tips and tricks and some closing thoughts on the Armenian faction for DEI. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the part 3 section of this video, where we talk about the verdict of Armenia. This will be a fairly quick verdict. I've kind of already said everything that I've wanted to say about the faction. It's a good faction. You start off in a fairly favorable position. You do have some weaknesses, but those weaknesses can also be turned into strengths, specifically your geography. You do have a lot of enemies around you, but you also do know where they should be coming from. So as long as you aren't involved in a bunch of different wars at once, you will be able to funnel your enemy's armies into places of your choosing, which will help you out indeed. Maybe even give you some nice ambushing battles, especially with your Catastrox units. That will be very juicy, and you'll get a lot of kills with that. The bottom line for you is dealing with the Seleucids. After you deal with the Seleucids, your next main issue will either be India or Parthia, whoever comes on top in the east. It's generally not really any other faction. It's possible that, say, Parthava or Bactria might become the top dog in the east, but generally speaking, the Mauryan Indian faction or Parthians will be your next threat in the east. Egypt can become a threat to you, but they also often end up fighting some of the Arabian factions and possibly the Madawi, so it's up to you when you want to fight Egypt for the most part. But again, when you're dealing with the Seleucids, try to time your invasions, or declaring war on them at the very least, to when the satrapies rebel against them, which is usually around turn 30-ish, but it depends on what submods you're using and a whole host of other things. And even then, it's not even guaranteed that all of his satrapies will rebel. It's generally based on the diplomacy rating the Seleucids have with that faction, so try to wait as long as you can, even though it will get the Seleucids more time to beef up their armies. Their armies are still going to be great and generally better than yours anyway, but you also have some excellent tools to deal with them. For example, your Catastrox will just slam into the rear with their Pikemen and obliterate them very nicely. So the Seleucids will be a very nice main challenge for you in your campaign, but beyond that, the majority of your neighbors are one-hitter quitter faction, so you take out one settlement from them and they're out of the game, which means that you can do some very quick rapid-fire wars, and you don't really have any other major threats around you. So generally speaking, your military is quite good indeed. Another thing to keep in mind is that your economy can get started very, very quickly. You have a lot of territory. However, all of that territory has almost no infrastructure to it, so you do need to invest a bit of your early game money into building up your buildings, and developing some trade relations. But as soon as you get that one settlement that is on the coast and gives you trade relations to all of the Greeks and Egypt, Rome, whoever you like in the Mediterranean pretty much, then you're going to have a lot of money flowing in. They're going to want access to your wine and gold and other resources that are nearby. So generally speaking, even though your economy, as most factions, starts off relatively poor, you can get the ball rolling very, very quickly if you so wish. You just need to spend a little bit of time and money investing, but beyond that, you wouldn't have too many things limiting your income potential from that, which is awesome. A lot of factions struggle with their economy, but I feel like Armenia shouldn't be one of them. The only reason it should really is that you're using way too many elite units in your armies, which will be very expensive and hard to do, so do be careful of that. And then my final point before we get to the difficulty level is that you have a massive amount of population at your disposal from turn 1, and this will only be improved on as you begin to take these one-hitter quitter factions that are around your kingdom. So you'll be having a lot more population at your disposal as the campaign continues, and you already start off with thousands of people ready to serve your king or queen in your armies, and you have a lot of them available to do so. So that's awesome. That's a very rare thing to say in DEI. Generally, a lot of these factions are going to be struggling with their population at the beginning of the game, but you will not be such a faction. But that's it for the verdict, guys. This is looking like a pretty promising faction. It looks like it has a generally easy start, and as such, I'll be giving this our first ever easy rating of 3 out of 10. Out of all the factions I have done an overview for so far, I've never given an easy rating to, and in my opinion, Armenia should be an easy campaign for you. 3 out of 10 for me is easy, a 2 out of 10 would be very easy, and a 1 out of 10 would just be stupidly easy. But 3 out of 10 is easy. It can slightly be buffed to be a little bit harder, depending on your difficulty, of course, but also depending on what decisions you make. If you just sit in your kingdom and turtle up for about 50 turns or so and allow the nations around you to get bigger, then you're going to have some issues, but still you have a great roster, and as long as you can outsmart the Seleucids, you should still have a fairly easy campaign. And Rome is so far away, they won't even become a threat to you if you don't want them to. It's not really all that common for Rome to end up in Syria and whatnot. Basically, you can take the fight to Rome whenever you like in the late game. And beyond that, I just don't see too much being a threat towards you. Like I said, great potential for an economy. You have a great army. You have a great starting position. You just need to be decent enough to use it to your advantage. So in my opinion, they are a 3 out of 10. They are generally a good faction for people who are new to DI, in my opinion. Just take your time with them, though. Don't rush it. If you get into too many wars at once, you can end up hurting quite easily. But as long as you're relatively smart and use some common sense, Armenia should be a nice, fun campaign for you to cruise on into, especially if you need a DEI. I recommend you check them out. It'll help you get used to factions that are not just Rome. And even though these aren't really a barbarian faction, they will have a variety of units for you to use that will also again teach you how to use units that are not Roman, which is generally what most people learn to use anyway. So beyond that, though, that's pretty much all we got to say about Armenia. I do sincerely appreciate you guys giving suggestions for Armenia. It's probably our second most requested faction, the first one being Parthia, most likely. So do drop your requests down below as always. I'll be trying to do these weekly moving forward. But until then, guys, thank you all for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I shall see you in the next one.